Okay, so we're diving into something pretty fascinating today.
Hmm.
The idea of a sovereign individual.
Yeah, it should be fun.
You sent over some really interesting sources, too,
Yeah.
like The Sovereign Individual,
Yeah.
Davidson and Rees-Mogg, right?
Yeah.
Published back in '97. It's kind of amazing how much they predicted about, like, the changes we're seeing now.
Yeah.
We've also got stuff on projects like Guava Nexus and Tamad XYZ,
Yeah.
which seem to, like, put a more modern spin on things.
Yeah. It's interesting. What's really captivating about this deep dive is how it goes beyond like just personal freedom, right?
Mm.
And we start looking at how individuals actually shape their reality,
Yeah.
especially in like this information age we're in.
Exactly. I mean, the sovereign individual really paints a picture of this whole transition, from industrial societies to information societies
Mhm.
and how that, like, changes everything. But I guess before we get ahead of ourselves, maybe we should start with some basics.
Yeah.
Like, what exactly is a sovereign individual? And, like, why should anyone even care?
So the book argues that a sovereign individual is someone who can operate beyond the control of like those traditional institutions.
Okay.
And they create their own value in this new landscape, right? They
Mhm.
leverage information
Okay.
and they leverage technology.
Okay, so that almost sounds, like, pretty radical. Like
Yeah.
someone who's, like, off the grid, living completely independently.
Mm.
Is that, like, what they're suggesting?
Not necessarily. It's a bit more nuanced than that.
Okay.
So Davidson and Rees-Mogg talk about how this transition is also a mega political one,
Okay.
right? So basically the way power works, even violence, it's fundamentally changing.
Okay. I think I'm intrigued, but also a little lost.
Yeah.
Like, mega political transition. What does that even mean?
Okay, think about it this way. So for centuries, physical force, right? That
Mhm.
was like the primary way to control people
Yeah.
and control resources. Governments basically had a monopoly on violence, Yeah.
And individuals had very limited options for pushing back.
Okay.
But in the information age, like, things are different.
Okay.
The cost of communication, it plummets.
Mm-hmm.
Individual knowledge becomes way more valuable. And governments can't exert control in the same way they used to.
So I guess what you're saying is that like the internet, right, with its ability to connect people and spread information
Mhm.
is actually like shifting the balance of power.
Exactly. That's precisely it.
Okay.
And this shift creates both opportunities and challenges for individuals.
Uh-huh.
It's no longer enough to just follow the rules or just rely on those traditional institutions.
Right.
You need to be more adaptable, more resourceful. You need to understand how to navigate this new landscape.
Okay, that makes sense. But where does this whole like subjective reality thing come in?
This is where it gets really interesting. So Davidson and Rees-Mogg, they argue that our ability to believe in stories, that's what truly sets us apart.
You know, these stories, whether we call them myths or religions or ideologies, they allow us to form these large-scale networks of cooperation.
So it's like the stories we tell ourselves about the world, they actually shape how we live in it.
Exactly. They create what we call intersubjective realities.
Okay.
These are beliefs and ideas
Mm-hmm.
that exist only in our collective imagination,
Okay.
but they have a really powerful influence on our behavior and the world around us.
Okay. Give me, like, a real world example
Okay,
so I can wrap my head around this.
sure. Think about something like a nation.
Okay.
It's not a physical object, right?
Yeah.
It's the concept, an idea that exists because enough people agree to believe in it.
Right.
We draw borders,
Uh-huh.
create symbols, we engage in rituals that reinforce this belief.
Yeah, and even though it's essentially, like, imaginary,
Mm-hmm.
it has very real consequences.
Absolutely.
We pay taxes,
Mhm.
fight wars, build infrastructure, all based on this shared belief.
Precisely. And the same goes for money, right?
Uh-huh.
Pieces of paper, digital tokens, they only have value because we collectively agree that they do.
Yeah.
Corporations, religions, they all work the same way.
Right.
They exist.
Uh-huh.
They exert power because we give them meaning.
That reminds me of, like, the example of Sarah Aronson and the NILI Underground.
Oh, yeah.
That was in one of the sources you sent.
Yeah.
They risked their lives for a Jewish homeland.
Right.
Like an idea that was still largely an intersubjective reality at the time.
That's a great example because it highlights how these shared beliefs can motivate people to take extraordinary actions,
Yeah.
even if the reality they envision hasn't fully materialized yet.
Right. But the NILI story also shows that, like, it's not enough to just believe.
Mm-hmm.
You have to actually act on those beliefs.
Absolutely. Paying taxes, building infrastructure, participating in cultural rituals, these physical acts, they maintain those intersubjective realities. It's like constantly renewing a contract with the collective.
So to bring this back to the sovereign individual, it seems like a key part of this is understanding how these narratives work.
Yeah.
And how these intersubjective realities, like, function.
And even more importantly, recognizing that these realities are not fixed.
Right.
They're constantly being negotiated and reshaped.
Which means, in a way, a sovereign individual can consciously participate in that process.
Exactly.
Rather than just being passively shaped by it.
Exactly. They understand that information isn't neutral.
Uh-huh.
It's always embedded in a narrative,
Okay.
a story that aims to shape our understanding of the world.
Okay, so we've got this idea of, like, shifting power dynamics, the importance of narratives, this concept of intersubjective realities. Where does this all lead?
Right.
What's the practical, like, application for the listener?
Yeah, well, that's where we get to the heart of, like, being a sovereign individual. It's about recognizing that, you have a role in shaping those narratives, those intersubjective realities. You're not just a passive consumer of information.
Right.
You're an active participant in creating meaning.
So instead of just accepting the stories we're told,
Yeah.
we can actually, like, question them,
Yes.
challenge them,
Yes.
even create our own.
Exactly. Think about it this way, like, before written documents, the concept of ownership.
Yeah.
That was itself an intersubjective reality.
Okay.
It was maintained not by deeds and titles, but by the shared understanding of the community.
So if everyone in the village agreed that, like, this plot of land belonged to Farmer John, then it did.
It did.
Regardless of any formal paperwork.
Precisely. Now, obviously, things are more complex today,
Yeah.
but the underlying principle remains the same.
Okay.
What we believe collectively has a really powerful impact on what becomes real in a practical sense.
Okay. That's pretty mind-blowing. But how does someone actually become more aware of these narratives?
Yeah.
And start, like, shaping them?
It starts with paying attention. Question the assumptions behind the news you consume, the conversations you have, even the thoughts running through your own head.
Right.
Where did those ideas come from?
Right.
What purpose do they serve?
It's like becoming more conscious of the information that's, like, constantly bombarding us.
Yes.
And filtering it through, like, a critical lens.
Precisely. And it's not just about being critical, right? It's also about being creative.
Yeah.
Davidson and Rees-Mogg, they predicted that the information age, it would be a time of tremendous opportunity
Okay.
for those who could leverage it effectively.
So instead of just being, like, swept along by the current,
Yeah.
you can learn to, like, surf the waves.
Exactly. You can create value by connecting ideas,
Yeah.
building communities, offering unique perspectives.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all connects back to the projects you mentioned earlier. Like Guava Nexus and Tamad XYZ.
Yeah.
It's like they're putting these ideas into action.
They are.
In, like, a really tangible way.
And each takes a slightly different approach.
Okay.
So Guava Nexus, for example, is all about creating a decentralized platform
Okay.
where individuals can contribute their knowledge and creativity. They call it like a collective brain for the information age.
And from what I've read, they're, like, very intentional about not trying to force any particular ideology or worldview on people.
Right. One of their documents even mentions how crucial it is to acknowledge that people trust their own ideas more than anything else. They talk about planting an idea in someone's head so they think it's their own.
That sounds a bit manipulative, doesn't it?
Well, it certainly raises, some ethical questions.
Yeah.
But they're not talking about brainwashing or coercion.
Right. Yeah.
It's more about understanding how people form beliefs and using that knowledge to create a more, like, engaging, persuasive experience.
So instead of, like, dictating what people should think, they're creating an environment where individuals feel like they're, like, discovering and owning the ideas themselves.
Precisely. And they do this through a variety of mechanisms, like these seed NFTs,
Okay.
which represent ideas or creative works that can be cultivated within the network.
So it's like planting a seed that can grow into something bigger through, like, community interaction.
Yes.
I like that metaphor. What about the visionary frame for subjective reality they mentioned?
Yeah.
That one sounds a bit out there.
It's their way of emphasizing that building a sustainable ecosystem, right?
Uh-huh.
It requires more than just data and analysis. You need imagination, intuition, a willingness to embrace possibilities that might not be immediately apparent.
So it's about balancing like the analytical mind with a more creative, intuitive approach.
Exactly. They acknowledge that an unchecked visionary frame can lead to like unrealistic expectations.
Yeah.
But they also argue that without it, we risk getting stuck in a purely mechanistic view of the world.
Which brings us to Tamad XYZ.
Yes.
And their use of Tamad, like the sovereign slacker, as a symbol for this concept.
Mm-hmm.
It seems a bit counterintuitive to use a character known for his laziness.
Yeah.
To represent something as like complex as the sovereign individual?
I think it's precisely why it's so brilliant.
Okay.
Remember, the sovereign individual isn't about conforming to traditional notions of success or productivity.
Right.
It's about understanding how power and information work in this new landscape and finding creative ways to leverage them.
And Tamad, despite his apparent laziness, often finds like unconventional solutions.
Exactly. He's like the ultimate life hacker.
Right. And that resonates with the idea that like the information age rewards those who can think outside the box.
Yes.
And find creative like shortcuts.
Exactly. So instead of just working harder, you're working smarter.
Right.
Tamad XYZ calls this decentralizing myth-making. They're inviting the community to participate in shaping the narrative of Tamad, moving away from these fixed myths, right?
Yeah.
And embracing a more fluid and evolving understanding of this character.
And by involving people in that process, they're creating like a stronger sense of ownership.
Exactly.
And buy-in.
Exactly. They even talk about targeting the superior temporal gyrus, which is a part of the brain associated with that feeling of certainty we get when we believe an idea is our own.
Okay, that's fascinating. So they're using insights from like psychology and neuroscience to make their project more engaging and persuasive.
Exactly. And it highlights a really crucial point. Understanding how our minds work, how we form beliefs, how we make decisions, that's essential for navigating this information landscape effectively.
So it's not just about having access to information.
No.
But about understanding how that information is processed.
Yes.
And how it shapes our perception of reality.
Yeah, precisely. And that brings us back to the core concept of the sovereign individual. The ability to control your own subjective reality.
Which is a pretty powerful idea.
Yeah.
But it also feels like a bit daunting.
Yeah.
If reality is subjective, if it's all just stories we tell ourselves, then where do we even like begin?
Right.
Yeah, it can feel like really overwhelming.
Yeah.
When you start thinking about how much our reality is shaped by like all these narratives, all these intersubjective realities. Like where do we even begin to take control?
Well, you've hit the nail on the head. It can feel daunting, but it's also incredibly empowering. Remember, these intersubjective realities, they're not static.
Right.
They're constantly evolving. And our participation, our actions, you know, they contribute to that evolution.
So it's not like we're like trapped in a predetermined reality.
Right.
We actually have the power to like influence how things unfold.
Yeah, exactly. And that influence starts with awareness. As we talked about earlier, question the stories you're being told. Pay attention to the assumptions, the biases that shape your perception.
It's like becoming more mindful of the like mental software that's running in the background.
Yes.
Like identifying the default settings and deciding if they're actually serving us.
That's a great analogy. And once you start to see those default settings, you can start to adjust them. Choose to believe in stories that empower you, that align with your values, and that contribute to a world you want to live in.
So it's not just about being like critical of the narratives we encounter.
No.
But also like consciously choosing the ones we want to embrace.
Yes.
And promote.
Precisely. And this is where creativity comes in. Don't just accept the limited options that are presented to you. Use your imagination to envision new possibilities, to create those alternative narratives that resonate with your deepest aspirations.
This reminds me of like what Guava Nexus calls the visionary frame. It's about stepping outside, you know, the confines of conventional thinking And like imagining a future that might seem impossible right now.
Exactly. And that visionary energy is crucial for driving change, for creating new intersubjective realities that benefit, not just ourselves, but the wider community.
But like, as we discussed earlier, you need to balance that visionary impulse with like a healthy dose of pragmatism, right?
Yeah.
How do you like translate those grand visions into like concrete actions?
That's where the sovereign slacker archetype can be surprisingly helpful.
Okay.
Tamad reminds us that sometimes the most effective path is not the most obvious one. It's about finding creative shortcuts, working smarter, not harder.
So it's not about like rejecting effort or responsibility.
Right.
It's about being resourceful, adaptable, and finding those like leverage points where you can exert maximum impact with like minimal effort.
Exactly. And this is where understanding the dynamics of the information age, this becomes so important. We have access to tools, to resources that can amplify our actions in ways that were unimaginable just a few decades ago.
Right. Like we can connect with like-minded individuals across the globe, share ideas like instantly.
Yes.
And build communities around like shared values and goals.
Precisely. And these communities can become incubators for new narratives, for new intersubjective realities that challenge the status quo and offer alternative ways of being and relating to each other.
So in a sense, the sovereign individual isn't just about personal empowerment.
Right.
It's about like using that empowerment to shape a world that's like more just, equitable, aligned with like our highest aspirations.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It's about recognizing that we're not just passive bystanders, in this unfolding drama of history.
Right.
We're active participants. Our choices, our actions, they contribute to the creation of the world we want to see.
That's a really powerful message to end on. It reminds us that, like, while the concept of the sovereign individual can feel, complex, even a bit overwhelming at times.
Yes.
The core message is actually quite simple.
Yeah.
Pay attention.
Yes.
Choose wisely.
Uh-huh.
And act with intention. The future's not predetermined. It's like being written right now.
Yes.
And we all have a role to play in shaping it.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for guiding us through this deep dive.
You're welcome.
It's been a really eye-opening exploration of the sovereign individual.
Yeah, it has.
And the power of these intersubjective realities.
Absolutely.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to continue this exploration on your own. Question the narratives, envision those new possibilities, and act with intention. The future is waiting to be written.